Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of All Things Policy. I'm Rohan Pai and I work as an assistant program manager at Takshashila, and today we have a special guest joining us for an episode. Hi Ananya, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
To briefly introduce her to you all, Ananya Rao is a researcher at Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, more commonly known as ATREE. Over the last year, she has been closely involved in working on the implementation of community forest resource rights in Chhattisgarh's Bastar district, which focuses on understanding non-timber forest produce or NTFP trade, specifically focusing on how to integrate NTFP-based livelihoods into community forest rights-based governance. Before we begin, I would like to bring to your attention that the applications for Takshashila's 3-month graduate certificate in public policy program are now open, and the deadline to avail a 10% early bird scholarship is 23rd July. We offer specializations in defense and foreign affairs, tech policy, and advanced public policy. So make sure to check out our website for more details. So let's begin. Ananya, can we start by understanding what non-timber forest produce is and what is the importance of NTFP-based livelihoods in the context of the Indian economy?
Yeah, so non-timber forest produce or NTFP, as is quite self-explanatory from the name, refers to all produce that can be collected from forests other than timber. And it's also referred to as minor forest produce or MFP. So this includes produce that can be consumed by people such as tamarind, mango, mahua flowers, mushrooms, roots, or various medicinal herbs, as well as things that are used as raw materials for many products, including industrial production like lac, bamboo, salseed oil, etc. So the quantum of income generated by NTFP is quite significant and crucial, both for the communities who are dependent on it as a source of livelihood, as well as for the Indian economy in general. So according to government data, forest dwellers in India, who are the primary collectors of NTFP, are approximately 100 million. And for these forest dwellers, NTFP constitutes approximately 20 to 40% of their income. And the population that's dependent on NTFP trade in general, which in addition to primary collectors also includes the procurers, the traders, other people in the network, is about 275 million. So other than NTFP trade being a significant source of income to those who are dependent on it, it's also a very significant contributor to the Indian economy. So a 2011 report calculated that the annual business turnover of NTFP is more than 6,000 crores per annum. And between 2019 and 2021, just in the state of Chhattisgarh, which is one of the highest NTFP procuring states in India, about 1,100 crores of NTFP was procured. And this is just the amount that is procured by the state. Research actually shows that majority of NTFP remains in the private domain, and only 10 to 20% of all NTFP procured is actually done by the state. The rest is done by private traders. So I'm citing these numbers just to drive home the import of NTFP being a very major important source of livelihood, especially for forest dwellers who historically always been a disadvantaged and vulnerable community.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. I believe that the government has introduced many policies and schemes to govern the trade of NTFP. Could you elaborate on some of these?
Yeah, so there isn't any one single comprehensive national level policy that governs all NTFP trade, but there are a few national level schemes and policies addressing certain aspects of NTFP trade or certain NTFP in particular. And these are executed in different ways by different states. So, to begin with, an important distinction to keep in mind is that different NTFP are actually subject to different degrees of state control. So some NTFP, usually the most valuable, are nationalized, which means that the resource is treated as state property And the harvesting, the transport, the storage, sale, all of these are carried out by the state or by state agencies. So some examples of nationalized NTFP are tendu leaves, sal seeds, and bamboo. Though sal and bamboo have now been denationalized in most states, but these were initially the first nationalized NTFP. Other than the nationalized NTFP, the state is also involved in the procurement of certain other NTFP through the provision of a minimum support price or an MSP. So presently, the state provides an MSP for 37 different NTFP. And finally, there are some NTFP where the state is not at all involved in the trade, as in there's no MSP and there's no state procurement. So these are generally the more low value NTFP like roots, mushrooms, and other smaller low value ones. So there are two main national level policies that govern NTFP trade at the moment. The first is the MSP for MFP scheme, which is a bit of a tongue twister, but it basically provides a minimum support price for these forest produce. And this was initiated in 2013. So this is a national level pricing policy and it provides a minimum support price for 37 non-nationalized NTFP. And the scheme was introduced mainly as a solution for the very low and fluctuating prices of these non-nationalized NTFP. So under this scheme, state governments are authorized to set up primary procurement centers where NTFP collectors can directly sell their produce at the declared minimum support price without going through any middlemen. So this scheme was mainly put in place to bypass the extensive network of middlemen that exists, which actually ends up taking a lot of the income in the middle or the gains. And so it was made to bypass this network to reduce the informal systems of credit that people were bound by and to increase the prices of NTFP in the market. The second scheme after the minimum support price scheme is the One Dhan Yojana. So the One Dhan Yojana was launched in 2018 as an attempt to strengthen the minimum support price scheme. So this scheme, One Dhan Yojana, focuses on training primary collectors and focuses on value addition to the NTFP. So the One Dhan Yojana basically aims to set up these centers called One Dhan Vikas Kendras, where each cluster of centers has 15 One Dhan self-help groups or SHGs, and each of these self-help groups will have 20 primary collectors. So the scheme stipulates or the policy stipulates that each of these SHGs focuses on processing particular NTFP into various different produce. So, for example, some Bandhan SHGs, they do like drying and packaging of medicinal herbs, or others process tamarind in particular into different kinds of produce like tamarind sweets and candy or tamarind sauce, or even just plain tamarind bricks. So basically, each of these Bandhan SHGs receives some NTFP and they process these to make it into a value added product and then they sell it. So these schemes are implemented in different ways by different states. So in Chhattisgarh, which is where I work, NTFP trade is facilitated by a specific body called the Chhattisgarh Minor Forest Produce Federation, or CGMFP Fed for short. And this was a body that was first set up in Madhya Pradesh. And once Chhattisgarh was carved out as a separate state, the federation also split. And so now it functions both separately in Madhya Pradesh and in Chhattisgarh. So the CGMFP Fed has actually set up a network of primary cooperative societies, which are meant to be cooperative bodies that consist of all primary collectors. But in reality, the primary cooperative societies have actually appointed SHGs or self-help groups to procure NTFP at the village level. So it is just the 10 odd members of these SHGs that procured the NTFP from the primary collectors. Then they do some primary processing like sorting or drying. And then the produce is sold to the primary cooperative society at the minimum support price. So then the primary cooperative society procures the produce from all these SHGs who are procuring at the village level. And then this produce either sent to the Vandhan SHG for further processing and value addition, or it is stored and then sold by the apex body of the MFP Federation in Raipur or in the state capital. So essentially, this body, the Chhattisgarh Minor Forest Produce Federation, is the body that regulates how the MSP scheme and the Vandhan Yojana is implemented at the state level and how NTFP trade is carried out in general.
Wow, okay, that's a very complicated system and a complicated network to be operating in. But these two schemes or policies that you mentioned, the MSP for MFP scheme and the Vandhan Yojana, what have been the results of these on the ground, and have there been any limitations?
Yeah, so definitely there have been good results as well as some limitations. So the minimum support price scheme, it has definitely led to higher and more stable returns for those primary collectors who are selling their product at MSP. So the MSP is definitely higher than the price offered by private traders for the same produce. And unlike the market price, the MSP does not vary from day to day, does not vary based on the quality of the produce or any other external parameters. So it's a fixed price. And as a result, those who are selling at MSP are assured of this fixed price. But one limitation this brings in is that because the MSP is so much higher than the market price that's offered by private traders, when the government further sends the NTFP that they procure from primary collectors, they will essentially be selling at a loss because the price they sell at will be much lower in the open market. So essentially, the scheme is more of a subsidy than a profit making scheme for the government, which entails that the government can actually only procure a limited amount of NTFP. One other good outcome of these schemes has been that the women who are a part of the self help groups, because most of these self help groups are composed of women, these are not only earning from the produce that they collect themselves, but they are also earning extra income through procurement and through processing. So in Chhattisgarh, for example, the SHG members, they are paid a commission on all the NTFP they procure. And they are also paid a fixed amount for the NTFP that they process. So there are these financial gains, and they have also gained other non-financial benefits like entrepreneurial skills, technical capacity building, and of course, a greater degree of independence. So being involved in the daily functioning of these SHGs for these women have provided them with various skills such as record keeping, packaging, operating machinery, negotiating sales. There are many of these skills they've gained. And many women also report that it's allowed them to gain a greater degree of independence from their families, where they are actually now able to make their own decisions, engage in work of their own outside their household. So, while these existing government policies have definitely had these positive benefits, they do definitely suffer from a number of limitations. So, the Chhattisgarh MFP Federation, for example, is one of the most extensive and comparatively active bodies that has been set up for procuring produce at a minimum support price. But even their reach is quite limited. So, they do provide better prices to the people they procure from, but they have reached a very small percentage of villages. There is a large majority of villages that have not at all been reached by this network. So they don't even get the opportunity to sell at MSP. And moreover, even within the villages where the MFP Federation has a very strong presence with one or even more active SHGs, many people in the village still continue to sell to private traders who offer much lower prices. And this is in part due to the lack of awareness regarding MSP because people do not know which NTFP is procured at a minimum support price and they don't know how to go about doing it and they don't know the process associated with it. The schemes and policies also, they don't take into account certain ground realities like providing for transportation to shift the produce from the village to the markets, right? How does the produce reach? There's no mechanisms to account for this. Or another thing it hasn't accounted for is providing storage infrastructure for collectors to store or aggregate their produce. So these are just a few ground realities that are very integral to the trade, which hasn't been accounted for by these policies. And most importantly, two areas that are glaringly missing from all of these government schemes and policies is A, the empowerment of people, and B, ecological sustainability. So the structure and functioning of the Chhattisgarh Minor Forest Produce Federation, for example, in practice doesn't allow only for any empowerment, because the self-help groups and the primary cooperative societies, they don't have any decision-making power. They are meant to be cooperatives, but actually they are agents in a very top-down system that's controlled by the apex body at the state level and the forest department also. So the state, so in this way, though, they have very little decision-making capacity. At the same time, these schemes also neglect the question of ecological sustainability, because none of their actions or provisions have contributed to enabling or to promoting forest conservation or sustainable methods of NTFP harvest.
Right. So it's always interesting to see how a policy in action on the ground is, whether it's effective or not when you're working in the field. So your area of work focuses on integrating these NTFP policies with community forest rights based governance. So can we start by understanding what CFR is and how it is connected to NTFP?
Sure. So the Forest Rights Act, or the FRA of 2006, was a landmark legislation in India which recognized finally the rights of forest dwellers to use and to manage forest land and resources. So it recognized their rights of habitation as well as their rights of cultivation, and it finally gave forest dwellers a voice in the conversion of their forest to non-forest activities. So essentially, it basically, after a very long time, recognized the traditional customary rights of forest dwellers. Now, community forest resource rights, or CFRR, are a very important provision of this act, which allows communities to use, manage, and protect and conserve their customary forests. So, broadly, there are two aspects to CFRR. One, it gives the Gram Sabha the right to own and to manage the forest area that has always traditionally belonged to their village. So, as an extension, it recognizes that all NTFP belongs to the Gram Sabha, to the village, and not to the forest department. At the same time, the CFRR provisions also demand that the Gram Sabha manage their customary forests, which most importantly entails that they use these forest resources sustainably and they ensure that this forest area is conserved. So this empowers the Gram Sabha not only to conserve their forest area, but also to regenerate forest areas. And it gives the communities the right, for instance, to say no to forest conversion and to have complete decision-making power in how their forest is used. So currently, the parallel pursuits of improving NTFP-based livelihoods on one hand and recognizing CFRR rights on the other hand are tending to pull in slightly different directions. So, like I discussed, while the NTFP schemes are very well intentioned, many of these schemes, they relegate the primary collectors or the gatherers of NTFP to the status of beneficiaries. So they have limited autonomy in the marketing process. And in this way, the collector is not given that decision making power, like I discussed before. The schemes also pay very inadequate attention to sustainable NTFP harvesting, which is, of course, essential for the well being of the forest and for the forest based livelihoods themselves to remain sustainable in the future. On the other hand, community forest resource rights, they incorporate a broader understanding of the well-being of both forest dwellers and the forest itself. And it represents a very inclusive decision making as well as an environmentally sustainable model of trade as its core values. So CFRR actually holds immense potential for enhancing environmentally sustainable forest-based livelihoods because it emphasizes the active decision-making role of the Gram Sabha in democratizing forest management. It holds the potential for the enhancement of forest-based livelihoods through collective action in a way that is also sensitive to, of course, the question of environmental sustainability.
Okay, moving on to the next question. What are some of the benefits of linking community forest rights and NTFP? Like, why do you think that this would help in forming effective policies on the ground?
Okay, so currently, as I discussed earlier, state procurement is being carried out in different ways. In Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, it's happening through this MFP Federation, which has set up the network of SHGs, like I described, to carry out procurement. Now, the main disadvantage of this system is that all the profits and the commission earned for procurement and primary processing is going only to the 10 odd members of the self-help group. And often the members of the self-help groups aren't the primary collectors of forest produce themselves. So the actual primary collectors are not receiving these profits. Also, the minimum support price scheme, like I discussed earlier, is basically a subsidy scheme rather than a profit-making scheme because the MSP is higher than the market rates. So when the government sells the produce, they're selling at a loss. So there is actually only a limited amount that the government can procure of NTFP. And finally, like I mentioned above, the current system of NTFP trade is completely within the control of the Forest Department, and it does not take into account the question of ecological sustainability as a parameter for regulating trade.
Right, that makes sense. So before we move on to the next part, we'll just take a short commercial break. Hi, so welcome back, everyone. We were discussing with Ananya about NTFP, which is non-timber forest produce, and community forest rights, and the linkage between the two, and her thoughts on why the intersection of the two is important. So yeah, we can continue that conversation.
Right, thank you. So, like I mentioned, some of the limitations of the current system of NTFP trade can be addressed by incorporating community forest rights based governance. So, CFRR provisions hold great potential for improving many of these shortcomings that I mentioned. For one, community forest resource rights mandates that the Gram Sabha makes a management plan to use and to conserve these forest resources. If the rights to organize the trade of NTFP is given wholly to the CFR Gram Sabha, it has a number of clear advantages. One, instead of the profits from procurement and processing going only to these select few members of the SHG, which also is decided by the state, which SHG gets these rights, it will go directly to the primary collectors themselves or to the Gram Sabha, who will then decide how these funds can be used for the collective needs of the village. It also empowers the Gram Sabha to aggregate NTFP in bulk and to organize trade even for produce that is not procured by the state at MSP. So aggregating these produce in bulk will actually allow the Gram Sabha to get a good price for these produce. The collectors of the Gram Sabha will also be empowered to make these decisions on their own without intervention from the Forest Department. And finally, very importantly, since CFRR management plans mandate conservation and protection of the forest, the trade will be carried out in an ecologically sustainable manner. So, of course, it's much easier to understand these things if you look at how it's playing out on the ground. And fortunately, we do have a really good example in India to look to for inspiration on how to successfully integrate CFRR rights with NTFP based livelihoods. And this can be seen in the Maharashtra model of NTFP trade. So, Maharashtra was the first state in India to deregulate NTFP rules and empower Gram Sabhas to be the primary decision making body in NTFP trade. So, in Maharashtra, every Gram Sabha can choose between two options with regard to the trade of tendu leaves, which is a nationalized NTFP. One, they can take the service of the forest department, like it exists in the current system, to sell these tendu leaves, where the forest department organizes auctions for tendu leaves before the season begins. And this is the existing procedure. So they can either opt into this, Or second, they have the choice where they can opt out of the forest department auction process and they can organize the sale of NTFP themselves, where they themselves identify the contractors, they fix the rates, they fix the conditions of the sale all themselves. At the same time, Maharashtra has also made it mandatory that all decisions for the collection, use, and disposal of NTFP in the scheduled areas of Maharashtra will be taken only by the Gram Sabha or by the Forest Rights Committee, which is a committee of the Gram Sabha, which has members that spearhead the process of claiming and managing community forest resource rights. So, as they've been empowered by these regulations, hundreds of villages have actually organized the auction of tendu leaves themselves. And this has actually led to very significant economic gains for the collectors. Many villagers have also developed and executed management plans for other NTFP, where they simultaneously increase trade and income, but they also at the same time put in place measures to conserve the forest area. So, a very stellar example of this is the village of Panchgaon, which has put in place a very extensive set of rules and regulations for the collection and the sale of forest produce, as well as its protection and management. So, their CFR management plan contains around 115 regulations and is focused largely on bamboo, which is their most abundant and their most lucrative NTFP. So, some of these regulations, for example, they have divided the bamboo forest into 3 compartments. And every year, one compartment is left completely untouched so that it can regenerate for the next year. There are also rules about how much bamboo can be harvested, and there are patrols that are set up to protect the forest and ensure that no trees are being felled. All bamboo sold through the Gram Sabha, and the daily wage that's paid to the members for forest management activities, not just harvesting but also protection and other activities, is actually higher than the Manrega daily wage. So it's quite a significant source of income. And data that was released in 2016 in a and also published recently in a Down to Earth article, it says that each household actually makes a minimum of 20,000 per year from bamboo. So many of the profits also then go back to the Gram Sabha to be put into the village to meet collective needs.
That's really interesting to hear how these things work out in different states and what the states are doing to enable these communities to work like this. But what do you think are some of the challenges that one might face while linking CFR and NTFE?
So I think one major shortcoming of the existing CFRR process, which would definitely hinder the augmentation of NTFP based livelihoods, would be the lack of involvement of women. So the CFRR claim making process has been in all the cases that we have observed, it's been led solely by the men. And women are barely involved, often not involved at all in any CFRR related activities. And this is actually in part because of the very incorrect assumption that women know less about the traditional use and management of the forests in the village because of the notion that they've entered the village only after marriage and while the men have been living in that village their whole lives. So, as a result, the CFRR claim making process, which actually aims to identify all the traditional uses of the forest and put that into the management plan, it has been excluding women from the process. And this is especially a hindrance to improving forest based livelihoods in particular, because it's the women who collect, process, and trade in NTFP. And it's they who actually know the forest and its resources, especially NTFP, better than anyone else. Another challenge for integrating the two is the fact that many of the most lucrative forest produce are actually harvested from within the village boundaries and not from forest areas. So, for instance, NTFP like tamarind and mango, they grow inside village boundaries and not in the forest. And with regards to these NTFP, a CFRR title would not provide people with any additional access to or rights over these produce, which could be a slight disincentivizing factor. So, similarly, another potential disincentive would be the reducing dependence on NTFP in the past decade or so, where there's been a reduction in dependence on NTFP, which has been spurred on by an increased dependence on agriculture, where most people are equally, if not more, dependent on agriculture as a source of livelihood. And as agriculture has been assuming greater importance, forests are increasingly being cut down to clear the land for agricultural fields. And this has led to a reduction in the availability of NTFP and a reduced interest in conserving or regenerating NTFP. Another challenge would be another challenge to shifting NTFP trade away from the state to the CFRR Gram Sabha is the fact that NTFP trade is actually still very much controlled by the Forest Department, as I mentioned, and this is a major source of revenue for the department. So the process of shifting this ownership may be slightly difficult as the department may be reluctant to give up this control. But regardless of all of these challenges, there is still immense potential for integrating the two, as demonstrated clearly by the experience in Maharashtra, where integrating CFRR governance with NTFP trade has not only led to higher incomes for the forest dwellers, but it's also paved the way for empowering these primary collectors, as well as ensuring ecologically sustainable methods of harvesting and trade.
Right. So I believe on that note, we'll have to end our episode here. But thank you so much, Ananya, for your insights on NTFP-based livelihoods and community forest rights. I learned a lot today about what these are and some of the nuances that you've seen in the ground in the last 1 year. We hope that we can host you more in the future and have more such insightful discussions.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It was great to be here, and thank you for having me.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.